invited or because you already knew the way. We are grateful for you and the gift of God that you are to us. And we pray for you every Sunday morning before we come out and lead our worship celebration. And our prayer, while it's not specifically these three things, we do ask that you would experience welcome, acceptance, that you would find peace and space to have an encounter with the living presence of the loving God in our midst this morning. Amen? Last week, we opened our current sermon series, The Art of Neighboring, in Luke chapter 10, around the story of the expert in the law asking Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" In this chapter, what we see is this exchange between Jesus and this expert, and it opens with that question, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" In response, Jesus asks his own question, two of them actually, to the expert in the law. He says, "What's written in the law?" You're the expert in the law. You should already know what's in the law. And I didn't mention this last week, but it's sort of an interesting observation, which is he believes that the answer to the question is found in the law. Because he goes to the law and says, well, what's found there? What do you find that's written there? And then after he asks him what's written in the law, he asks him another question, which I think is equally important, which is, even though you find what you will find in the law, how do you understand it? How do you read it? The expert replies in verse 27, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. He plucks from the law two passages, one from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6, and the other from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, I believe, or 18, verse 19. So someone can fact check me in real time. Just don't yell it out. And he takes those two. No, not funny for any of you? Like maybe two of you? Gosh. All right, tough crowd this morning. He takes those two obscure passages, one from Deuteronomy, one from Leviticus, and he strings them together out of order into his answer. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus replies in verse 28, then go and do likewise. That's it. But we know, if we were here last week, or if you've read the story, or if you're looking at it now on your iPhone or in your Bible, or you've memorized it because you've hidden the law of God in your heart, you know that the expert asked Jesus a clarifying question. Who exactly is my neighbor? Now, we concluded last week that as much as Jesus invites us to love our neighbors as ourselves, our love of neighbor has to start somewhere. And last week I suggested that our love of neighbor starts with our literal, physical neighbors, the people who live closest to us. So we moved forward in the passage last week in Luke chapter 10, and we explored the story of the Good Samaritan. And as we read that story, we'll come back to it in a moment, we realized and discovered that Jesus expands the definition of who neighbor is to also include our enemies. Now, as Christians, I think any of us who have decided already to follow Jesus, we know that we're supposed to love our enemies. But as I noted last week, my biblical knowledge has far outstripped my ability to apply. Now, this call that we have from Jesus to love our neighbors, including our enemies, as ourselves, is a difficult call. It's like the call that he places on us to follow him through the narrow gate into life. And I think as we process this, we realize something, which is we have no hope of loving our enemies if we don't actually know or are able to name or have had much interaction with our physical neighbors. So this brings me to my practical tip from last week, which will wind up being my practical tip for this week, but I get ahead of myself, which is we should try to figure out who our 8 closest neighbors are. Why did we pick 8? Because it creates a perfect grid, 3 rows and 3 columns, and I'm sure for those of you who are in the sciences, that means something significant to you. And so you find yourself in the center house, and you want to find the 8 closest households around you. Now, I did this with you last week, all right? So I just want to report that I was able to name 5 of my closest neighbors last week. All right? So just in case you think I cheated and went ahead and learned them all so that I could show you up, no, I'm just like one of you. I don't know all of my neighbors. Fortunately, my wife does. So I talked to her, and I filled out the bottom row, Judy, Bob, and Ruth. Now, Ruth's selling her house, so we're going to get a new neighbor in a little bit. Now, as I talked to some of you throughout the week, or even at the celebration last week, some of you were like, oh, man, that was really uncomfortable. I don't know any of my neighbors' names, but I know what cars they drive. And I know what time they leave to go to work. And I know how many kids they have because they're often throwing things into my yard. And so, I think this whole idea of us trying to learn our neighbors and meet our neighbors and then start to love our neighbors as an expression of what Jesus calls is a journey that we can all sort of start and collectively go on together. Now, let me just note that Jesus has a lot of mercy, grace, and forgiveness for us when we fail to meet his expectations of loving our neighbors as ourselves. So as we attempt to do this, learn the names, and learn to love our neighbors, I realize that there are probably 3 basic challenges that stand in front of us. The first being isolation. It's super easy for us to leave our homes, wherever we might find ourselves, whether in an apartment, a homeless shelter, a dorm, or if we have a single detached homestead, with our heads down, focused on the task that we have for the day, trying to grind it out at work so that we can get our tasks done and feel like we've accomplished something. And then at the end of the day, we don't see our neighbors and our opportunities to meet them and greet them and interact with them as a respite. We see it as more work. And so we retreat into our homes to try to find a place of refuge. Now, many of us, if we're fortunate enough to own our homes, we may have built fences that are 8 feet tall. They're called privacy fences. Why? To create space so that we don't have to interact with our neighbors. In American culture, our community shifted where we used to sit out on our front porch to us sitting out on our back porches, should we actually find ourselves in a homestead where we actually have a porch. So I think isolation is one of the things that we are going to struggle with as we attempt to meet and greet and learn the names of our neighbors. The other one is fear. Remember, the empire invites us to live in fear and hatred of those who are unknown to us. And for many of us, that leads us to be weary of our neighbors. I have this sort of phrase, a turn of phrase that I like, which is a 50-cent theological word. It's called a hermeneutic, the way that we sort of understand and study things. And I like to talk about having a hermeneutic of love or a hermeneutic of suspicion. And if I'm being fully honest with you, not that I've been lying up until this point, I tend to live my life in a hermeneutic of suspicion. So just sort of like weary first before I'm just sort of trusting. Now, my wife, on the other hand, totally lives in a hermeneutic of love. Completely lives in a hermeneutic of love. She hasn't met someone or something she couldn't love. Now, me on the other side, I can tell her where the boundaries are and how she shouldn't, but, I'm learning, she's learning, it's all good. The empire wants us to be afraid of the unknown because the unknown is scary. So if we don't know our neighbors and they don't know us, guess what? It's easy for us to imagine the worst about our neighbors. Misunderstanding, I think, is the third basic challenge as we attempt to follow Jesus and the greatest commandment and love our neighbors as ourselves. And this is a huge thing. There are lots of stories here. I've been guilty of some of this myself. I won't tell that story today, but I will tell someone else's story. They were looking at their neighbor's homestead, and the garage was broken. They had a couple broken down cars in it, and they lived in a community where they had a strict code of conduct for how your house was supposed to be treated, like your yard was supposed to be mowed, and you couldn't have certain things like broken down cars in front of your house. And so instead of going over and checking in on the neighbor to find out why things seem to be in such disrepair, we just did the American thing we called law enforcement. And they show up and they issue the ticket, and they wind up talking to a neighbor. You know how that goes. Oh, can you believe them? They have this broken down car in their house. They're bringing down all our property values. And the other neighbor happened to know the story about the neighbor. And they're like, oh, yeah, that neighbor recently, their spouse died, and they have a debilitating disease which has kept them in the house, so they haven't been able to sort of keep things up. And so now you can sort of see like that guilt starting to run in on that other person, because they're like, oh, crap, I totally just piled onto a worse situation, right? And this is where misunderstanding comes into play. Now, for many of us, this might be my situation, which is, I probably shouldn't say this out loud. But I'm going to. So we all have to rake our leaves, right? And in the city of Ann Arbor, we changed the way that we raked our leaves. You used to be able to rake your leaves all the way to the curb. They sent a truck, it'd suck up your leaves, and then off you go. Well, the city was like, no, that's too much money, it's too much time, you've got to bag your leaves. The compost truck comes, and then it goes that way. Well, some days there are windy days, okay? And some days you can put leaves in a pile on a windy day, and at the end of the day, the leaves won't be in that pile anymore. So a neighbor may or may not have done that, and then those leaves wound up in my yard. All right, here we go. So back to Luke chapter 10. So misunderstanding about how we were going to, no agreement on how we were going to take care of our leaves. So as I briefly noted last week, as we were looking at the story of the Good Samaritan, which is found in Luke chapter 10, if you have a Bible, or you can get one off of the cart, or you have your iPhone or your iPad or your iDevice, and you can go online, go ahead and turn to it now. Last week in this story, I noted some things about the main characters, the priest, the Levite, and the Good Samaritan. And I had a really good question from a congregant after the sermon, and so it just really drove my sermon prep this week, so I wanted to come back to the story. So I noted that the priest who passed the man who was beaten, so quick story overview for you, Jesus is answering the question, who is my neighbor, by telling the expert a story. He tells the story of a guy who's been beaten, and then 3 people walk past him. And then at the end of the story, he asks Jesus, who became a neighbor to the man? Or Jesus asked the expert. So going back into the story, the priest who passed by was probably on his way home from his work in the temple in Jerusalem, because the story goes that they were on a road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and it's about a 17-mile pathway. And so it would take about a day for you to traverse it if you were walking. Now, the priest was probably on his horse on his way back, and in the temple was served by 3 people, the priest, the Levite, and the layman. And the priest was sort of the first class. They were the highest order in the temple. The Levite was sort of a second class because they assisted the priest. And then the lay people, they were sort of the third and final class. Now, the priest, who was probably on his way home, having worked in the temple for 2 weeks, because you'd have like a 2-week on, 2-week off assignment, he was in a bind. If the man that he encountered on the road was a Jewish man, then the law said he had an obligation to render help to him. But the man was beaten and unconscious, so he couldn't ask the man of his ethnic origin. Now that leads to a whole other question, which is, if you weren't Jewish, he didn't have an obligation to you, so maybe there was something sort of interesting going on in the law to start with. Now, since the man was unconscious, stripped of his clothing, the priest who was riding by couldn't actually interact with the man, because to do so, he might make himself ceremoniously unclean, which would prevent him from serving in the temple, as I noted last week. If he was prevented from serving in the temple, then he would be also prevented from taking care of his family and his servants. They would all become unclean because he became unclean. And if the man was actually dead, not just beaten, there was a whole nother set of rules that he would have to go through, having interacted with a dead body on the street. Let alone the fact that he was maybe responsible for the tithe. So in the ancient world, people would tithe to the temple, and then the priest would distribute that money to the poor in the communities in which they lived. Now, if he was ceremoniously unclean, he couldn't fulfill that obligation. So you can just start to see that there's layer upon layer upon layer of decision making that the priest is making as he's encountering the person. Now, the way I've inherited the story, I just inherited the story as the priest is being rude, right? It's just like, oh, he sees the guy, he can't be bothered to help him, he's just going home, right? But I think I have a little bit more of empathy towards him because it may be for us that we find ourselves much like the priest. Remember, this is a story that Jesus is telling, and in every story, he's trying to make a point. So here's the point that I think he's dealing with, which is the priest has a dilemma. Does he render aid, or does he keep himself in a position so that he can feed his family, take care of his servants, and serve his community? That's the question that he's being asked. Now, how many of us, when we see someone stuck on the side of the road in a disabled car, how many of us pass by? I don't say that to judge you, at least not that harshly, right? I mean, I just did it yesterday. Our family was coming back from Greenfield Village, and we were on the getting on to 94, and there was a guy in a broken down car. Well, my kids are asleep, and I'm like, I am not handy at all with cars. I'm like, there's a key. You put it in this thing, you turn it, and it should come on, and then there are these two pedals, and you press one to go and the other to stop. That's the extent of my car now. And then I pay the bill when it comes for the car, but that's it, you know? And then there's a light that comes on when you're supposed to change the oil. No, okay. None of you? All right. No, you're supposed to do that before the light comes on. Even I know that. So, I mean, how many of us are ready to stop when we see someone broken down? Or what's more important for us? Getting to work on time in the morning? Getting the kids off to school? Getting our errands done? Or keeping our partners and our family members happy by completing the tasks and errands that they've given us? Or getting home in enough time so that we can watch our favorite TV show? Right? I don't think we're too dissimilar from the priest in the story. And then the Samaritan explodes onto the scene in this story. The Levite completely wasn't going to do anything because he is second class to the priest, and if the priest walked by, a Levite's not going to upstage a priest, right? So he's just like, hey, my boss didn't do anything, so I'm off the hook, you know? He's my covering, and so I'm just going to keep on going. And then the Samaritan explodes onto the scene, and he does the unthinkable. The Samaritan in this story is the hated other. If the expert in the law expected Jesus to say anything, he expected Jesus to tell him that a fellow Jew would stop and offer aid and assistance. But that's not what Jesus does. Watch this. Instead, Jesus has the hated other offering aid and assistance, and this hated other do what the beloved others, the priest and the Levite, refuse, which is to prioritize the needs of others above their own. And I think that fundamentally is what Jesus is getting at in the story. How do we prioritize the things that are going on in our lives? In one sense, if you thought of the law as saying maybe anything, what the law is saying is learn to love God and to love others. If your obedience to the law prevents you from loving God and loving others, then maybe you're not actually honoring the law. See, the Samaritan risked his life by stopping and offering aid to this beaten man. And in this story, what I see happening here is the Samaritan overcomes isolation, fear, and misunderstanding. And he becomes a neighbor to the injured man. So Jesus actually accomplishes 2 points in this one story. He says, you know, you would demean the hated other because you feel like you're better than the hated other. But I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to put the hated other as the one that is sort of the winner, as it were, in the story, right? He's fundamentally saying there is no us versus them. There's only us. And then he invites the expert in the law and those who hear, and thus us today, to check our priorities and understanding of what it means to be the people of God. And that's the invitation from Jesus. Learn to overcome, with my help, Jesus is saying, overcome your isolation, your focus on yourself, your fear. This is just a risk, right? You know, we're confronted with all these sort of scenarios in our lives, and we often have to take risks in order to follow Jesus. And your misunderstanding, and learn to become a neighbor. So, you know, in the tradition of preaching, let me offer you 3 immediate benefits of loving your neighbor, all right? Just to get it down to a 3-point sermon for you, though this is probably point 7 or 8. When we endeavor to practice the art of neighboring, and I want to start by saying it's an art, right? And the one thing I've learned about art is that it's not a science. And so art says that you can try some things and see what works, right? And the things that will work for me and the things I'm going to unpack for you, they may not work for you. And here's the beauty, is God has endowed you with creativity. And he wants to use your creativity to partner with you to love your neighbor in the way that he's commanding you to do so. So first of all, I think that we can increase our sense of connection. You know, many of us live these relative lives of obscurity, working hard to make ends meet, carving out what little time we have for ourselves, our family, and our own already known to us friends, right? We were at Greenfield Village, like I said yesterday, and we ran into some friends that we've been trying to get together with while we were there at Greenfield Village. And we were talking, and we made the observation, if we had planned to come today, we probably would not have made it. And so it was better that we just ran into each other while we were here today. And it's just like, so I get that sort of the tyranny of the schedule, right? Where you feel like you're being controlled and managed by something outside of your control. But there's a space for us to try to figure out, well, maybe something needs to move down in the priority list so that we can create more space to be interrupted. So I think that whole idea that we live these lives of relative obscurity is an incomplete truth. In fact, we all have stories and gifts and talents and experiences that make up who we are. And one of the things that I've been trying to do as I've sort of realized that I haven't been able to practice this is when I meet people, especially new people, I don't always ask the question like, who are you and what do you do? Because that just talks about what you do for money. And it just re-emphasizes that all of our focus is on money. I ask people a different question, which is, what brings you joy? And let me tell you, when people answer that question, sometimes they get sort of taken aback by the question at first because they're not expecting that on a first-time greeting. They're preparing the answer for, what do I do for a living? And then you ask what brings you joy. It interrupts the narrative. And so then they have to think about it. And for a lot of people, and this is a sad reality, is a lot of people are like, man, I have not experienced joy in a long time, so I don't know how to answer that question. And that's a revelation in and of itself, right? And so I love like throwing parties and cooking food, especially good food, and that brings me joy. And then I like eating it too. And so it's just like, yeah, that's what I love. And all of you have an answer for that. And you can start thinking about it now. What brings you joy? When we endeavor to practice the art of neighboring, we can increase our sense of community, our sense of belonging. Recently, a friend relocated from her house in the suburbs for greener pastures, right? You know, I don't want to live in a cul-de-sac, 8 little cookie-cutter houses, a little safe little place. I'm going to move to a grittier place. After moving and living in the better place, she decided to move back to the burbs in the neighborhood with 4 other friends. And here's her reflection, which I think is worth sharing. Parenting, life, and friendship, marriage, they're not hard for me because I'm in the wrong place. They're just hard. I just thought that was a great observation, right? You're just like, you're blaming the place in which man, it's really hard to be married and have all these kids. So I'm going to move to a place where there are other people who are married who have all these kids and see if that'll make it better. No, it's like, maybe the things that you're endeavoring in life are just challenging. They have their challenges. So she goes on to say, so I'm finally willing to accept that there's no geographic place that offers perfect peace. Because wherever you go, there you are. Let that sit with you for today. Life is uncomfortable. So I might as well get busy loving the people around me, she remarked. I'm going to stop trying so hard to decide whether they are the right people for me and just take a few deep breaths and learn to love my neighbors. I'm going to take care of my friends, and I'm going to find peace in the burbs, and I'm going to quit chasing happiness long enough to notice that it's smiling at me right where I am. You know, this morning we were just sort of shooting the breeze about theological things in the lobby because we tend to do that. And we were just reflecting on some of the things that Jesus said, a few of us. And, you know, we were just remarking that how difficult it is for us to really live in the space and in the skin that we've been given. That the culture and the empire is always orienting us towards some perfect future out over there. The empire never just tells us to be satisfied and satiated and to be content in the place in which we find ourselves right now. And wouldn't it be amazing for us if we just imagined that God was present and at work in our lives right where we are? And we've created within us an openness to the reality that he's already at work, and our task is not necessarily to imagine this future place where everything is great, but to ask God, how do I take one step closer to partnering with you right now? How might that change our priorities? How might it reorient us? No. When we practice the art of neighboring, we can extend our lives, meaning we can live longer. As a matter of fact, a new study, the Pew Charitable Trust came out with a new study. Coming to church actually extends your life. So tell your neighbors and friends, get them here so you can all live longer. And this is true. I'm not kidding. I'm not just saying it because it's self-serving. It is, completely. Come to church. Study after study reveal a simple fact. People who know their neighbors live longer. They actually did a study in a neighborhood, like this one little neighborhood, I think it was in Pennsylvania, and they studied this community because of all of the things that were leading causes of death. They weren't affecting this community in the same way they were the larger community. And they wanted to figure out what it was. Like, they literally wanted to know, is it in the water? Is it in the dirt? You know, what it is. And what they discovered was they were all just really good neighbors. It was just a community that actually did it. Right? This is how we overcome this isolation. So when you believe that your neighbors are generally trustworthy, you're more likely to interact with them, whether it's a chat by your mailbox, a helping hand with a package, or a simple wave and a smile. This type of interaction can lift your mood, reduce your stress, and it can instill in you a sense of belonging. Those benefits, in turn, have been linked to better health, including a lower risk of heart disease, digestive complaints, and sleep problems. Now, obviously, all of you, if you're like me, you're like, yeah, but that neighbor has a dog, and I can't get to sleep, and the digestion is because they smell, their food that they cook just makes me sick to my stomach, right? You're all doing that, but suspend all of that, okay? And just accept the primary premise of the study, which is the more we know our neighbors, the better we are. And here's a bonus for me. We bought our house 10 years ago, and we immediately met our neighbors to the west. And we hadn't moved in because we had a little bit of work to do in the house. And so we weren't in the house every day. So it was like almost a month that we weren't in the house. And one day, we had given them our telephone number at this point. We get a call from our neighbor, Ruth Ann, and she's telling us that an alarm is going off in our house. Now, we hadn't known her well enough to have given her a key at this point where she could have gone in. She now has a key to our house, actually, and we've needed her to have a key to our house because we've been locked out of our house several times, and we were grateful she has a key to our house. Now, our other neighbors, Ben and Anna, had a key to our house, but they live like 1.5 miles away, so it's like a long walk to get the key, so we're grateful. Or I think you guys have our garage door key or something, so anyway. So we hadn't, given her a key, so we had to drive 30 minutes to the house and discover that it was a smoke detector that was going on. So she totally saved our house from burning down, right? So, get to know your neighbors, at least the ones that are trustworthy. I have 3 practical tips for you as I close. The band can make their way back to the stage. Again, let me come back to this whole idea that this is, it's an art, not a science, okay? So you're going to try a bunch of things, and some of the things you're going to try are going to work, and some of the things you're going to try, they're not going to work so well. So the first thing is, I think we need, if you're like me, goals are helpful, okay? So you just need an orientation around the goal. So I'm bringing back out the neighbor map, okay? And here's why. And I'm going to bring it out every week for the 4 weeks of this series. This is week 2, so for 4 more weeks, to give you 4 weeks to try to meet your neighbor, all right? And any of you who want a prize at the end, fill out the map, and at the end of the sermon series, bring your completed map to me, and I will give you a prize. Whoa. And it'll be a good prize, all right, because I give out good prizes. It'll either be money or chocolate. Okay. So we'll see how much money, and depending on how many there are of you who actually take me up on this. So fill out the neighbor map, because it's a way of orienting a goal. Because you could be like, all right, I know the neighbor who lives above me, but I don't know the neighbor who lives below me. And now you have a goal. And now you can start listening to the practical tips for how am I going to try to meet this neighbor, okay? And we're going to try to give you some creative ways of meeting your neighbor. And let me just say this, because I realized I didn't say this last week. The goal of this sermon series is not for you to get to know your neighbor so that you can invite them to church so that they might be saved in some way, all right? I just want to take that off of the table if any of you were wondering, because that's so toxic, it's awful, all right? Who wants to be befriended only to be sold something that they may not yet know that they need or want, right? All right, good. That's the story of casting pearls before swine. If you give them something they can't digest, they may turn instead and eat you. So that is our goal, is to keep you alive, that your neighbors not turn on you in that way. We just want you to meet and learn your neighbors. You would have never thought I would put those two together, would you? I see it in your face, but that's how my mind works, and I just shared it with you without filters. All right. There are introverts amongst us, all right? You are a different kind of person than me, and I realize that I have to come towards you in a different way, so I actually talk to introverts about how introverts can get to know their neighbors, all right? So that you're not just doing a bunch of extroverted things like throwing parties, which is all of my answers. Okay, so fill out the map. The second thing is, and I think this is a way for us to pray for our neighbors that's not manipulative, is to catch your neighbors being neighborly. When you see your neighbor doing something neighborly, just note it. And here's something that I want to encourage us to do. Note it, but actually come in on Sunday and write a little post-it and put it on our answer prayer wall as a way of just praying for your neighbors to be neighborly. And then you'll see them being neighborly, and then you can put it on, right? So the neighbor who pulls in the trash cans, the neighbor who gets the mail, the neighbor who cleans up the trash in the neighborhood, just note those things down. And when you see a neighbor being neighborly, pay attention to it, remember it, and then come at church on Sunday and put it up on the answer prayer wall using a little post-it. I think it'll be fun for us to see how the wall fills up with us catching our neighbors being neighborly. All right? All right. And then here are some introverted, friendly practical tips. Gardening. I'm not really good at gardening. I was actually talking to Zeke this morning, Frank's son. He planted some garlic last October, and he has a garlic clove with him this morning at church. And so I see him every Sunday because they get here a little early while the band is practicing. I was talking to him sitting on the stoop, and he's like, "This is the garlic I grew in my garden." And I was like, "That's awesome. Things won't grow in my garden." He's like, "Why not?" And I go, "Because there's too much shade. I have to cut down a tree." He's like, "Well, it's growing in mine." And then he kept telling me about all the other things that he's growing, snap peas, sweet peas. He was quite delighted about it. All right, so gardening. There's this space between your sidewalk, if you own a home, and the street. It's called the easement, I think, or the easeway, something like that. Easement, that's what it's called. In some communities, you can actually plant flowers there, and that will make your neighborhood look a little bit better, right? That's it. You don't have to talk to a single neighbor, and you've totally blessed everyone because they can see beauty every day. delivering cheer. Some of you are good bakers, you're good cookers, you're good knitters, you're good crafts persons, so you can make wreaths. So when we moved in, Maria made wreaths for all the neighbors, and then we delivered them, and that was the way that we met them. And then we saw them put them on their doors as opposed to like giving them away at their next garage sale. And so that was like super cool, right? And so I like to bake cookies, chocolate chip cookies with real butter so they taste delicious, or lard so they taste extra, extra delicious. You could do that and deliver it to your neighbor. And here's the thing, because you're thinking, no, Donnell, that's still extroverted because I have to talk to the neighbor. No, you don't. You could just make the cookies and put a card on it and ring the doorbell and just walk away. And it's a different kind of ring and run, right? It's not a bag of poop. It's a bag of cheer. It's so much better, right? All right. Don't light it on fire either way, okay? No one? Okay. And then if you're nerdy, because there are those of us who are nerdy and like computers and the internet, and then I wrote this one up, and I was like, well, if I'm going to ask people to do it, I might as well do it myself. There's a website called nextdoor.com. There are a lot of these, but they have your neighbors, and I joined my neighborhood last night, and all 284 of my neighbors have profiles on this application, Nextdoor. And so if Maria wasn't available to tell me who my neighbors were, I could have figured it out on my own. So here's a way for it. Now, there's some lines that I need to make you aware of. First of all, there's the creepy line, all right? So don't go on it to be the creepster, all right? And so we'll let your internal judgment help you with that. And if you need, some extra guidance, call me and I can tell you, yep, that's creepy, stop. All right. So you can go on, find out who the 8 closest neighbors are, learn their names, and then when you see them, you could actually greet them by name as if you've already met. And they'll be like, oh, I forgot we met, and now it's all on them. Ah, see, I'm helping you out. All right. The other thing is this is an easy way for you to see what's already going on in the neighborhood, yard sales, barbecues, school activities. You can go online and do that. It's super simple. You can put as much or as little information about yourself as you want in case you're concerned that the government is spying on you, which they are, so who cares at this point? All right, that's it for my practical tips. Someone is going to lead us in our Sean's going to lead us in our offering, our continuation of our act of worship through giving. So get your money ready. And then Anna Hilliker is going to come and lead us in communion. All right? All right.
All right.